as a regulator for the renewable energy sector. And these amendments also seek to correct some legislative and regulatory oversight that spill over from the last administration. Because later in my presentation, we must not allow the public to forget. And I will mention two things right now that I will spend some time on later in my presentation. The Cahill project and the sale of BNTCL to Saul. Don't let us forget those two matters. And as I dive into my presentation, you will see why FTC's role as a rate setter is very important, particularly with that Cahill project. But Mr. Speaker, there's some history that we have to discuss with respect to renewable energy. And back in May 2009, the Barbados Light and Power, who's the sole utility service provider back then, or who was the sole utility service provider back then, submitted an application for a review of their rates to Fair Trading Commission. That's Fair Trading Commission mandate, to review the rate, to see how the rates are, and if indeed the rates reflect market conditions, and if the rates are suitable to the consumer, and they're fair and they're just. But in addition to requesting the rate review, Light and Power included the application with a proposal for the renewable energy rider on a pilot basis. This signaled the beginning of the renewable energy producers, the ability for them to set up either domestic or commercial plants. This rider came into place, and we talk about the renewable energy rider. The rate came into place, we call it that, in 2010. And it was created on the pilot basis to allow the small consumers selling electricity to the public grid to receive an amount of 31.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So from 2010, it was formalized that all renewable energy producers can indeed receive a rate of 31.5 cents per kilowatt hour. That is what Light and Power would have paid them if they engage in renewable energy electricity generation, either at the domestic level or the commercial level. For the domestic level, the capacity was some around 5 kilowatt systems, and for the commercial level, they started out at, I think it was 50 kilowatt, and it graduated to 500 kilowatt for those commercial systems. And the rider, renewable energy rider, or the rate, was created by FTC for the small players, despite FTC had no authority by law to set rates. So the last government, that is why I said they're tinkered with the renewable energy sector for 10 years. In July 2012, we would have seen an increase in the fuel prices because the rate, the renewable energy rider, the rate that was created by FTC, that rate was linked to the fuel clause adjustment, which means that that rate was linked to the price of fuel. And in some cases, you saw the rate moving from 1.8 times the fuel clause adjustment to a rate that represents 1.6 times the fuel clause adjustment. But when we started out back in 2010, the investment in renewable energy was profitable because the price of fuel was high as well, and the banks were happy to see those renewable energy persons who were investing in not only domestic systems, but also commercial systems. But as the price of oil began to spiral, you had the boom and then the bust. This volatility methodology of coming up with a rate that is tied to fuel became problematic. And again, there was a fundamental change in 2016 when it was deemed appropriate to move away from linking the value of the rider to the avoided cost of fuel. Now, Mr. Speaker, this signaled the beginning of another era in terms of the renewable energy sector. Because the Fair Trading Commission, the Ministry of Energy and Water Resources, along with the Government Electrical and Engineering Department, spearheaded though by Fair Trading Commission and Barbados Light and Power, came up with a flat rate, which we call the Renewable Energy Rider, because the time has come for them to delink this rate from the price of fuel. And that rider rate was 42 cents for PV solar, and I think it was 31.5 cents for wind. So any person setting up a system through PV solar and selling the electricity to Light and Power, they would receive a rate of 42 cents per kilowatt hour for their system. That is for the energy that they produce and is being sold to Light and Power. And for anyone who set up a wind turbine or a wind system would receive 31.5 cents per kilowatt hour. That signal the linking, and the rider was then created on a resource cost basis. And indeed, what we begin to look at when FTC came up with that rate was the whole elements of setting rates in terms of installation costs. We look at the cost of solar PV. We look at the decrease in cost, because over the years, the cost of PV inputs and the equipment begin to decrease. They also looked at the cost of capital. They also looked at operations and maintenance costs for the system, which is associated with operating and maintaining a project, and is essential and is assessed, on an annualized basis. So several things went into coming up with that new rider rate. But the only thing, the difference between that rider rate and the feed-in tariff rate, which I will speak to shortly, was that the feed-in tariff rate was for 20 years, while the rider had no specific, the rider is for 20 years, but that rider, those persons who came in before the feed-in tariff rate was announced, they were red circle, and they had that rate for 20 years. But new entrants into the market after the feed-in tariff rate was announced on September 24th, they were pinned to these rates that came up through a feed-in tariff methodology. And I will get into that at this stage, because early in the year, there was a ministerial statement by the Minister of Small Business, Entrepreneurship and Commerce. It was not read in the chamber, but it was laid in the chamber. That speaks to the feed-in tariff and auctions for renewable energy technologies. And Mr. Speaker, on September the 24th, 2019, the feed-in tariff rates were agreed upon, and they took effect from October 1st, 2019. Mr. Speaker, the feed-in tariff program's capacity, which was determined by the Ministry of Energy in consultation with the Fair Trading Commission and Barbados Light and Power, is 32.7 megawatts for systems up to 1 megawatt. So 32.7 megawatts out of the total 600 megawatts have been allocated for renewable energy systems, whether wind, biomass, PV solar, for systems that are less than 1 megawatt. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, under the FIT program, capacity is allocated on a first-come, first-served basis, and submission of a complete license application secures a spot in the queue of eligible projects. And I'm reading from the statement, Mr. Speaker. The FIT rates, which took effect from October 1, 2019, will remain in effect until the total capacity is exhausted, and I speak about the capacity of 32.7 megawatts that has been allocated for the 1 megawatt systems, and that's what that feed-in tariff rate is catering to. That capacity, these rates will stay in effect until that total capacity is exhausted, or until December 31st, 2021, whichever comes first. So renewable energy producers or IPPs will get that feed-in tariff rate once they receive their license from the Ministry of Energy and Water Resources. They are responsible for issuing the licenses, while the Fair Trading Commission is responsible for rate setting, and that has to be made clear. Now, Mr. Speaker, the FIT program makes provisions for renewable energy systems in 4 categories: solar, land-based wind, biogas, known as anaerobic digestion, and solid biomass. And these categories, Mr. Speaker, are subdivided into 9 subcategories based on the size of the renewable energy systems and the corresponding rates. Mr. Speaker, members in this Lord Chamber, members of the public, there are 5 tariff categories for solar, there are 2 for wind, there's 1 for biogas, and 1 for biomass. And Mr. Speaker, what I will do at this time is to present these rates in this chamber. So the 5 solar categories go as follows. For solar up to 10 kilowatt, the feed-in tariff rate is some 42.75 cents per kilowatt hour. So if you set up a system up to 10 kilowatts, you will sell all of your energy to Light and Power to the grid, and you will receive that rate of 42.7 cents per kilowatt hour. So if your system is a 90 kilowatt hour system, you multiply that 90 kilowatt by the 42.75 cents, and you see what your return is. For solar systems above 100 kilowatt to 250 kilowatts, the rate is 41.75 cents. And for solar systems above 10 kilowatts, I missed that one, to 100 kilowatt, the rate is 44.75 cents. Solar systems above 250 kilowatts to 500 kilowatts, that feed-in tariff rate is 38.25 cents per kilowatt hour. And for solar systems above 500 kilowatts to 1 megawatt, that rate is, for solar, is 36 cents, 36.25 cents per kilowatt hour. Land-based wind, up to 10 kilowatts, the rate is 39.75 cents per kilowatt hour. Land-based wind, above 10 kilowatts, but up to 1 megawatt, which is the limit for this feed-in tariff methodology, is 38.25 cents per kilowatt hour. And biogas, up to 1 megawatt, is 42.25 cents per kilowatt hour. And solid biomass, up to 1 megawatt, the feed-in tariff rate is 52.25 cents per kilowatt hour. In all, there is a total of 25.7 megawatts allocated for solar, up to 1 megawatt. And indeed, there is a total of 32.7 megawatts out of the 600 megawatt capacity allocated for these smaller or less than 1 megawatt systems. And Mr. Speaker, this is signal, and these rates, Mr. Speaker, I'll make this document a document of the House. It's the Fair Trading Commission decision and order on feed-in tariffs for renewable energy technologies up to and including 1 megawatt. And Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate the Fair Trading Commission. This is something that the last government attempted to do, but they did not complete it. And I'm saying within less than 2 years in office, this administration has brought some excitement to all those renewable energy investors and also to the small businesses. Because come with this announcement are jobs for our people, whether it's artisans, persons can now lease their rooftop and receive a rate for 20 years. Because the investment that I just articulated here, as it relates to the various technologies and capacities, are in place for 20 years. And Mr. Speaker, the government recognizes the potential for renewable energy development to facilitate job creation and diversify participation within the energy sector. The government has therefore taken the position to inject further certainty into the market, and the Fair Trading Commission will use the feed-in tariff methodology to determine rates and procurement methodology for renewable energy systems between 1 megawatt and 5 megawatt. So we didn't just stop at the 1 megawatt, but we are looking at investors who want to invest in larger systems. So we have created a category from 1 megawatt to 5 megawatts, and the Fair Trading Commission is busy with the consultants coming up with a rate for the various technologies, like I articulated, for those technologies less than 1 megawatt. But Mr. Speaker, these rates between 1 megawatt and 5 megawatts will be published and made available as soon as these legislative amendments of the Utilities Regulation Act and the Fair Trading Commission Act are completed and approved in both houses. So, Mr. Speaker, we are not finished as yet, because there are bigger players who want to come into the market with systems greater than 5 megawatts. And what we have done, Mr. Speaker, for renewable energy systems above 5 megawatts, we call these bigger players independent power producers. And I will discuss that later in my presentation, because these players, the IPPs, are still renewable energy producers. But what differentiates the IPPs from the renewable energy producer, the IPP is a subsector simply because the IPP deals with larger capacities. That's why when I speak about 5 megawatts, I talk about an IPP, an independent power producer, and not a renewable energy producer. But the IPP is a subset of the renewable energy producer. But these IPPs will also impact the grid, because the larger system can have a significant impact on the stability of our grid. And they also recognize that the standard of service is critical. So you will see the Fair Trading Commission Act being amended with reference to IPPs and not the Utility Regulations Act, because the standard of service is, they are more articulated within the legislation of the Fair Trading Commission Act. But Mr. Speaker, For systems above 5 megawatts, the IPPs can negotiate directly with the public utility on the terms and conditions as approved by FTC and consistent with maximum rate setting to be set by FTC. So we have given the larger guys, the IPPs, the leverage to negotiate their rate. And we didn't use the feed-in tariff methodology, which will give them a fixed rate. But we have allowed these larger players to negotiate with Light and Power. But FTC has a role as the regulator. FTC will make sure that these rates are reflective of market rates. FTC will make sure that the investor gets their return on investment of 10%. But also FTC has the remit to ensure that the consumers are not taken advantage of. So we have to ensure fair competition. The investor get their fair share, because when you invest in a country and when you invest in renewable energy, and I will speak to some of the monies that we have here, coming into this country. I just mentioned over the next decade, this sector is about a 3.5 billion to a 5 billion sector. But the average 1 megawatt system of solar PV requires capital investment of 3.5 million. That's the average system. One average system of PV solar requires an investment of $3.5 million. And we're looking at gross revenue, annual revenue of something in the vicinity of $700,000 to $725,000 annually as gross revenue. So when you invest in a system of that magnitude and you are guaranteed this rate on your investment for a 20-year period at a 10% rate of return, do the math. It is simple. You will be paying back for your renewable energy system within less than 5 years. So this is a wonderful investment. And we are getting jobs for our people, and we are getting investment coming into our country that is needed at this time. So, Mr. Speaker, I know those persons who are listening to this debate, those persons who have invested and who have licenses, and I will speak to the licenses now where we are. I know they're excited, and this is good news for them. And as I stand here, FTC is presently negotiating a rate for a system above 5 megawatts. So FTC is doing what they have to do. And we now have to amend the legislation to ensure that FTC has the power under this legislation to control and regulate the interests of the investor as well as the interests of the rate-paying consumers. And I can't leave out the rate-paying consumers. But let me say to you, Mr. Speaker, we have seen from 2010 in this sector, and I want to just let the public know what transpired between 2008 and 2018. This is a sector with a capacity of 600 to 625 megawatts. That's the capacity of the system, the total capacity, our 2030 target. And it's not cast in stone, but that has been articulated by all technical studies within the Ministry of Energy and by the consultants. So we have a capacity of close to 620 megawatts to build out between now and 2030, which is over the next decade. But look at where we are today from 2010. This is very interesting. There are 24 megawatts of consumer-owned distributed renewable energy. 24 megawatts out of a capacity of 625. And that's owned by consumers. Those are the small renewable energy players. producers who would have invested in their systems. Only 24 megawatts so far invested by those. And Barbados Light and Power, I've invested in a 10 megawatt solar PV farm in Trent St. Lucie. So when you add 10 and 24, what you get? 34 megawatts as at September, as at the end of this year. That's about 5.4% of the total capacity. So between 2010 and now, only 5.4% of the total capacity has been taken up. So that is why he said the last administration tinkered with the renewable energy sector. And I'm going to show you why later. But I also want you to know that an additional 20 megawatts of licenses were issued under the Renewable Energy Rider program in 2019. So the Ministry of Energy issued an additional 20 megawatts of licenses. They're not on the grid, but they have been issued. And when you add 24, 10, and 20, that's 54 megawatts out of a total of the estimated 625 megawatt capacity. That represents just over 8.5%. So we are at a delicate stage in the history of this country. And we have to push this sector. So these legislative amendments are critical for us to move forward in this sector. Only 8.6% have been committed thus far out of the 625 capacity that we have allocated to reach our 2030 100% renewable energy target. And Mr. Speaker, when we look at the investment after 2021, because we now have to add that 32.7 based on what we have done for the systems for 1 megawatt that I spoke to you about. That is 32.7 megawatts that have been allocated for systems of 1 megawatt and under. And if we add that, we only get 14% that have been committed thus far, up to 2021. And why I'm giving you these figures, because after 2021, we have 8 years to install 86% of the renewable capacity in this country. After 2021, we have 8 years to install the remaining capacity in this country. And if you divide that equally, the challenge would be to install roughly 67 megawatts of renewable energy capacity annually from 2021 to our target goal of 2030. So we are faced with a situation as a result of the inertia of the last administration. We have now to fast track the renewable energy investment and projects in this country to achieve our 2030 goal of average around 600 and 625 megawatts of capacity. We have to install annually after 2021 67 megawatts of renewable energy capacity each year. And 67 megawatts is a lot, but we can do it. We can do it because, Mr. Speaker, as I speak to you, in the absence of the tourism sector, our premium foreign exchange earner, we need investment to spur the growth. And this is where it is coming from. The FTC, as I speak to you, is preparing a rate for biomass technology for a waste-to-energy plant at Vaucluse in St. Thomas. As I speak to you, the Fair Trading Commission is busy preparing a rate for biomass technology for a waste-to-energy plant at Vaucluse in St. Thomas. And, Mr. Speaker, the size of this plant is a 25 megawatt waste-to-energy and biomass plant. And the investment for this plant is some 320 million Barbados dollars of investment. So when you can sit and tell me that this government ain't working, something is wrong. I don't want to thank the Prime Minister again. I want to thank the minister in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, Minister Cattle, and her team. I want to thank the consultants, Avinash Prasad. I want to thank the Attorney General. I want to thank the Minister of Energy and Water Resources. And I want to thank the FTC and the consultants within the Ministry of Energy. And this is a team approach to investment in this country. We are not sitting down twiddling our thumbs. The Prime Minister is on a mission to transform lives in this country, and this cabinet, led by her, is on a mission to transform lives in this country and to ensure we were doing very well prior to COVID. While I don't stand here and say glowingly that I like the decimation of the tourism sector, no one will ever say that, because that is our number one foreign exchange earner. But what I like is that we didn't sit down nor roll up and cry and say, let's wait until the tourism sector rebounds. We push new frontiers, and we sort of fast-track investment in the renewable energy sector. And not only in the renewable energy sector, I want to pause at this time and congratulate my Minister of Agriculture, my friend and member for St. Philip South, who is busy in that ministry, that no one paid close attention to in terms of food security and reducing our food import bill like we are doing with the energy bill. But he has taken that baton, but he didn't take the baton, he had to pick it up, and he had to run with it. Nobody passed it to him. We can't talk about anybody passing anything to us. We had to start from scratch. We had to make batons and then begin the race again, because everything was decimated and destroyed in that sector. And this sector, people were tinkering with the sector for their own self-gratification. And I'm going to speak to that shortly. So that investment of $320 million in a 25 megawatt waste-to-energy plant at Vaucluse will do several things for us. It will address our garbage situation, because we are burning organic waste, disposing of our organic waste, and through the Minister of Agriculture, he will make available all the fallow land, all the idle land, to be used for the production of biomass. And he has already identified that. Because when we start this plant, we are looking at 20% local organic waste, and we are importing 80%. But that can't deter us, because all the cost-benefit analysis, they're being done by Minister Cattle and her team, and all prospects look good in terms of the return on investment and in terms of what investment will come to this country next year, and I think even before, and the creation of jobs. So, Mr. Speaker, we're in this chamber today with a very, it seems simple to amend these legislation, but they're very important for Barbados' future. They're important for our children's future. They're important for the working class people of this country's future. And they're important for closing that gap. And as the Prime Minister said Saturday, they're important for raising the flooring. The ceiling has no limit. But when you raise the flooring, you raise up your people and you give them opportunities that they never had before. And this sector will create immense opportunities and jobs. I spoke about persons leasing the rooftop. Persons can also lease the land. But I want the Barbados Light and Power, and I'm going to propose this. I didn't speak to it back then, but the buy all, sell all methodology that Light and Power has, you produce with your system, and you sell all of what you produce to Light and Power. And Light and Power, say you produce 300 kilowatt hours from your PV system or your wind system. You sell all of that to Light and Power, but you're connected to Light and Power's grid. But Light and Power bills you as normal. But what you produce may be more than what Light and Power bills you. And there is a net credit that will be given to you. And every 3 months, though, once that credit reaches $1,000, Light and Power gives you a check. But I wish to request that every month, once these investors who will owe the bank money, so they have to repay their loans for these big and medium-sized investment in renewable energy technology, I would like Light and Power to pay them on a monthly basis as opposed to on a 3 months basis. Because the 3 months basis, who pay their bills every 3 months? I pay my bills every month. And I know creditors come knocking at my door every month. And I'm not saying it in a bad way. I am asking that the FTC and Light and Power sit and come up with a system, the buy all, sell all system, whereby the investors can receive their returns, not every 3 months, but every month, because they have the bank to pay. I just wanted to mention that to you. But Mr. Speaker, I don't want to dwell in the minor. And the minor, for me, today was major for some yesterday. And the member for St. Michael West, I'm sure he would agree with me. Because FTC's role as the regulator and the rate setter for renewable energy, this is nothing new to FTC. It is new for renewable energy, but not setting rate for electricity generation. But I wish to recall the Cahill fiasco. The Cahill fiasco, which was a 40 megawatt waste to energy plant. And not only a 40 megawatt waste to energy plant, but it was unproven technology where you are burning 1,000 tons of waste per day. And it had temperatures from this plasma gasification plant of some 1,500, 600 degrees Celsius emanating from these systems. And you had this technology in the first world was only successful for 8 months. You can't call that success. Because if a plant runs for 8 months, burning 1,000 tons of garbage per day, that's not a success rate. We have to talk about failure, Mr. Speaker. We can't talk about success. But this unproven technology was brought to this country by a bunch of men who were looking after their interests only. And let me tell you why they were looking after their interests only. The rate given to Barbados Light and Power was a rate of 66 cents per kilowatt hour. So when you set up this waste to energy plant, this plasma gasification plant, you were going to sell the electricity to Light and Power at 66 cents per kilowatt hour. Mr. Speaker, members of this chamber, members of the public, I challenge you to call Light and Power and ask them if this is not one of their gas turbines in efficient operations. This is the cost of running one of their old gas turbines inefficiently, some rate of 66 cents per kilowatt hour. This is what we were going to put in modern Barbados, that rate, and in St. Thomas, in rural Barbados, with temperatures of over 1,500 degrees Celsius. And you were going to be paying, Light and Power was going to be paying you because the rate was negotiated between the government of Barbados and Light and Power, Barbados Light and Power. FTC was taking out of the picture. Because you know why? Because had FTC been in the picture, that rate of 66 cents per kilowatt hour could not have passed FTC. How did they get that rate? Now let me tell you something, members of the chamber, Mr. Speaker. That rate, in my view, was lotto, jackpot, and interest all in one for somebody. And who would have to pay for that? Ordinary Barbadians. We would have to pay for that in our electricity bills. So I don't know what cost-benefit analysis was done with this Cahill plant at all. But 66 cents for a waste-to-energy plant, and I'm telling you, the proposal by the investor to negotiate with Light and Power for the plant at Vaucluse that have just articulated is way less than 66 cents per kilowatt hour. So, Mr. Speaker, don't let us forget, and when we hear people talking, FTC was excluded from the negotiations between the last government and Barbados Light and Power because the rate that was submitted from the last government, the last administration, of 66 cents per kilowatt hour would have raped this country and the taxpayers. And Mr. Speaker, you know, the honorable member for St. Michael West will agree with this statement that the Almighty, He watches over us. He presides over us every step. And I saw it over the last 2 weeks. I will speak to that shortly. I saw it over the last 2 weeks. So, Mr. Speaker, you have seen FTC in this legislation before the chamber, giving FTC the right, and the legislative framework to mediate in these deliberations so that the consumers are not charged a use price for their electricity bill, so that the taxpayers in this country, they are protected. And when FTC review the insurance premium, the capacity factor, which look at how much of the plant utilization you will be using, the operations and maintenance costs, I have the whole list here, the cost of capital, the install costs, several things FTC review in order to come up with a good rate. But Mr. Speaker, that is not all. FTC had to intervene in the sale of BNTCL to Sol. That's a fair competition matter. And the last administration was literally giving away BNTCL. But look and see what BNTCL is doing now. I want to thank the Minister of Energy, who has assumed the office in 2018, and have reshaped Barbados National Terminal Company Limited to put a renewable energy focus on the Barbados National Oil Company and the Barbados National Terminal Company Limited. So we are now focusing on renewable energy. And I said in opposition that the Barbados National Oil Company should be renamed the Barbados National Energy Company or something like that. That we should be leading the charge in renewable energy and not Light and Power pulling us along. And that happened on the last administration. But I thank the minister for focusing, amongst the other things that he had to do, to stop the flow of feces in the road on the south coast and to ignite this critical sector. And we are here this morning to tell a wonderful story and to paint a lovely picture of what is to come shortly. And I spoke about job creation within this renewable energy sector. This sector has created a new category of work for existing artisans and tradesmen, electricians, roof installers, and engineers, rental of rooftops and lease of properties, by landlords. All construction workers, small, large, and medium size, as well as job seekers from the Barbados Community College and the Samuel Jackman Prescott Institution. So we are developing a cadre of workers, not only those persons who are within the field, but we are making sure that our institutions, the Community College and the Samuel Jackman Prescott Institution, these guys and ladies understand the importance of getting into this sector. Auto mechanics, Mr. Speaker, will be trained in electric vehicles and energy storage. The legislation is silent on energy storage. One of the amendments before the House is energy storage and how we will treat with energy storage. But, Mr. Speaker, I have given you the picture of how one investment, a 25 megawatt waste-to-energy plant, can ignite this sector. And I'm hoping that the work will start, and I know the minister within the Ministry of Finance, the member for St. Michael's South Central, she will speak on that because that's her portfolio, and I know she knows exactly what is happening there. She has done the numbers. I haven't done the numbers. All I'm focusing on is setting the rate. Not that I'm not interested in the numbers, but we all have our various ministries to look after. And she has done her work because she brought that proposal to the Fair Trading Commission and asked the Fair Trading Commission to intervene to ensure that this rate is a respectable rate. And this rate has taken the interests of all parties, the investor, the consumer, and the other stakeholders. But, Mr. Speaker, just before I get into the bill, you know, the last 2 weeks, Mr. Speaker, for me, was somewhat of an experience. And, Mr. Speaker, the picture that was painted of the Minister of Small Business, Entrepreneurship and Commerce, who is seeking to build small business in this country, who has walked the length and breadth of Barbados, not only giving trust loans, but looking at business sustainability in terms of the opportunities for small business men and women to help them survive, not only during COVID, but pre-COVID-19 and after. And indeed, while cash is not the only thing to make a business successful, we recognize that the system has significantly retarded the growth of small businesses in this country. And when I talk about the level playing field, it was misinterpreted. But, Mr. Speaker, creating a level playing field in business is creating that platform where all businesses can operate. And I heard the Prime Minister mention raising the flooring. Raising the flooring. I say narrowing the gap. Narrowing the gap. And correcting all the historical inequities that existed within the business system in this country. But I'm not vexed with the public, because the public elected us to lead them. And if they're not comfortable with a statement, they have a right to say what they want to say. I am not upset with the public. Actually, what this has taught me is that communication is very important, effective communication. And indeed, when I sat down with those used car dealers, those small businessmen, from since last week, Monday, in my office, I cancel every appointment. I received calls. I want to thank those persons who called, who offered words of encouragement, and they asked me, Minister, why are you so upbeat? I said, my conscience is clear. I have the interests of small businesses at heart, and I've demonstrated. Judge me by my actions. That's all I said. Judge me by my actions. And my conscience was clear. And I, like you, remember for St. Michael West, I have a God too. And we have the same God that we serve. Right? And it was a revelation, sitting down with these small car dealers, used car dealers, and articulating what a vehicular policy can do for them and can do for the country. How it can move them from the informal stage to the formal stage in this country's existence as we seek to build out this economy. How we are here to protect them. How we are here, and I think some of it was published. I think my mom sent me a note this morning, and she said, "Thank God." I said, "Mom, you serve the same God." Because at the end of the day, what I preach in 2018 and 2019, I continue to preach. I met with the used car dealers and practice as well in 2019 on a matter. And indeed, they were able to tell me on yesterday, but Mr. Minister, you discussed this. But the picture that was painted, you know, I don't want to go any further on it, because you had a 2-minute clip of a 20-minute interview where he said I will level the playing field for small businesses, used car dealers, new car dealers. The playing field has to be leveled. These small businesses have a right in this playing field. We can't create another playing field for them and a smaller playing field. They have to play in this wicket. They have to play a ball on this wicket. There are no 2 wickets in this country. And within the law. So that vehicular policy, they're happy. And I want to thank those persons who came and met with me from Monday last week up until Monday this week. I want to thank you. But I don't see why, and I will end on this note, I don't see why that garage on the Mount Hill in St. George, and I will call the gentleman named Cleedon Harris, I don't see why he can't be a registered assembler of vehicles in this country. He has a wealth of experience. I don't see why Tom in Good Intent in St. George can't be a registered valuer for vehicles. And I can call many members of used car dealers and mechanic and body men, because we need to create a register of assemblers and a register of valuers in this country. And the small businesses have to begin to think about big business. Don't see yourself as just having a small business. That is why Shine Auto Spares, young man Dario, down in Black Rock, he speaks to me in the affirmative. I want to transform my small business into a big business, along with others. And that is the push we have to make. We have to create some big businesses out of these small businesses from working class people. But we have to protect them. So my duty as Minister of Small Business Entrepreneurship and Commerce, while I elevate the small businesses, I have to put the legislative and policy framework in place that they are protected. And that's all I am doing. But I end on that note, on that matter. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill introduces terms such as renewable energy resource, renewable energy producer, public grid, storage, and independent power producers. And these definitions are being incorporated because I don't want to spend too much time going through every detail in the act. But if we begin with the Utilities Regulation Act, we will see, Mr. Speaker, the Section 2 of the Utilities Regulation Act, Cap 282, is amended by deleting the definition of rates and substituting with a new definition that includes renewable energy producers. So before, the rate was every rate, fare, toll, charge, rental, or other compensation of a service provider. And we now add to it our renewable energy producer. We have a new player in the sector, a new category of player in the utility sector. and that is the renewable energy producers. Section 3 of the Act as well is amended by inserting the following new subsections immediately after subsection 2, and it speaks to the role of the Commission. The Commission may request a service provider to provide the Commission with information relating to operations, finance, or such other information as the Commission may consider necessary to perform its function. All we are saying here, Mr. Speaker, is that the Commission must have the right to get your information to come up with a good rate. Your financial data, your operation data, you know what I mean, your cost of capital, review your books. So they can call and ask for information related to your operations or finances that can help them arrive at a good rate for the renewable energy producers. And Mr. Speaker, after Part 4 in the Act, we have inserted a new part called Part 4A, and it is titled Renewable Energy. And it speaks to in-connection agreement, the public grid, renewable energy producers, and renewable energy resource. Those are the definitions that have been included. And Mr. Speaker, just briefly on interconnection agreement. Mr. Speaker, you set up a plant. No, let me use the member for St. Michael West. The member for St. Michael West, through you, Mr. Speaker, sets up a plant where he is sitting. That's his PV plant or his wind plant. And I am the grid. So you have to get that electricity, that energy to my grid. Between the member for St. Michael West and myself, we have to determine who will bear that connection cost. So you're at your station and I'm on the grid. So in an effort to make sure that the consumer don't carry the burden of that cost has to be shared between Light and Power and also the renewable energy producer, which is the person who's investing in the plant. So that's why we have interconnection agreement mentioned, and the definition means an agreement which establishes the terms and conditions under which a distributed generation system that produces or stores energy from a renewable energy source connects to the public grid. So, Mr. Speaker, that is clear. When you're speaking about interconnection, basically the FTC has to determine the allocation of the interconnection costs, i.e., will the utility cover most of these costs in the rate base to be passed on to the consumer, or will the IPP cover some of them through the power purchasing agreement? So that is all we are saying. So FTC now has the remit to set a cost called interconnecting costs. Mr. Speaker, the Fair Trading Commission Act as well has to be amended, because when we look at the Fair Trading Commission Act, we see some of the same definitions within the Fair Trading Commission Act. But we have to differentiate between a renewable energy producer and an IPP, the independent power producer. Independent power producer, I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, is a subset of the renewable energy producer. The only difference is that the IPP, independent power producer, deals with larger systems. So you'll see the legislation of the Fair Trading Commission Act referencing IPP, because the IPP is the larger system, can impact the national grid, the public grid. So if you are given energy through solar or wind, which are variable renewable energy sources, you know that during the night the sun doesn't shine. And you know that certain months of the year there is variation with respect to the strength of the wind that can power the turbines, that can run the turbines. And indeed, wind and solar, they are variable. So we have to make sure that the standard of services or the standard of service for the IPPs who are putting energy from solar and also from wind to the grid, we have to make sure that they satisfy the requirements through the Ministry of Energy and through the government electrical and engineering department, who is responsible for the grid code system. And that is why FTC, that is why we have ensured that the Fair Trading Commission Act, as it relates to the standard of services, we had to put something in there to regulate IPPs. So, Mr. Speaker, most of the changes are relatively straightforward with respect to renewable energy. Amendment go on to lay out the renewable energy remit of the Commission in relation to rate setting and the standards of services that I mentioned there, standard of service here, sorry, and the distinction between renewable energy producer and the IPP. And when we amend, we also make provisions for the collection of operation and financial data from the renewable energy producers. And Mr. Speaker, this gives the regulator access to the much needed country and market specification information to allow for the determination of more market reflective rates. So all this information requested by the Commission has to do with rate setting. As it relates to the Utility Regulations Amendment, we also expanded the function of the Commission, the function of the Commission in relation to a renewable energy producer entering into an interconnection agreement or other agreement to supply electricity to the public grid, and we list what they are supposed to do to establish the principles of arriving at rates to be charged, set the maximum rates to be charged under the agreements, direct renewable energy producers to submit the proposal for the rates and terms and conditions relating to the agreements, and in performing the functions under subsection 1 that I just listed, the Commission shall consult with the renewable energy producers, representatives of the consumer interest groups, and other interest parties, and shall have regard to the national energy policy, the national environmental policy, and it went on, the requirement to promote renewable energy. So, while these amendments are somewhat straightforward, and we have included all elements to cater to give FTC the power by law to control and to regulate the interests of investors and the paying consumers, we had to, this is very fundamental for us to move forward. These are the foundation blocks that we have laid for the renewable energy sector. But one thing, Mr. Speaker, that I want to end on, the area that I wish to end on, is this whole aspect of storage. And Mr. Speaker, this legislation was silent on storage. And indeed, if we're to move forward with respect to variable renewables, we have to build in storage within our legislation, because storage is also critical to the transport sector as we transition to electric buses and electric cars. The stored capacity, Mr. Speaker, can be used to charge buses during the off-peak hours, and that's at night. So while the legislation was silent on storage, we had to include storage in these amendments to make way for storage as it relates to the variable nature of the renewable energy technologies, that of the solar and that of wind. But in addition, Mr. Speaker, we know that when a cloud passes beneath the sun, or when wind happens to drop off suddenly, the energy being fed into the grid is not available, and that makes the grid unstable. But how you can stabilize the grid is with that stored energy. When you run your plant and you have that stored energy during the peak hours, if you're having any challenges, you can draw on that energy, that is stored energy, to put to the grid to stabilize the grid. So, Mr. Speaker, those are some of the amendments. And energy storage as well, Mr. Speaker, can save the utility and its consumers by eliminating the needs for large transmission lines and infrastructure, So when you have storage, there's no need now to have, you can reduce the cost by the utility for having these used transmission lines and this used infrastructure by just factoring in storage. But we look to mature renewable energy jurisdictions, that is FTC, like Germany and also California, to understand how they have dealt with this issue of storage and how energy storage can offset the solution. And California is a great example of where energy storage may help to balance the grid through the use of energy storage, because the target goal there have some 33% renewable energy by this year. And indeed, in order to achieve that, they had to install storage capacity. Germany, I said, it was also critical. But energy storage as well is critical in the interest of the utility, because the utility can store that energy that is produced by its plant and not used, such as the wind energy at night, and release that stored energy during the day when the demand is high. So, Mr. Speaker, here we are with these amendments to the Utility Regulations Act and the Fair Trading Commission Act to give the fair trading the power by law to set rates for renewable energy. But, Mr. Speaker, I end by speaking on the enfranchisement of local participation. And, Mr. Speaker, only last week, we formed a renewable energy co-op. And we cannot speak to only big business. We have to speak to small business. And we are seeking to ensure that the working class people get their fair share of investment within this renewable energy market. And within my ministry, the Ministry of Small Business, Entrepreneurship and Commerce, we formed a renewable energy co-op. Myself and the Minister of Energy, we will leave here this afternoon to the official function of that renewable energy co-op. And all it is giving the working class people the opportunity to invest as well, to have their fair share of the renewable energy sector in this country. And that is consistent with this government trust of raising the flooring, even if there's no limit to the ceiling, closing that gap. We cannot only focus on foreign direct investment. We have to, but we have to make sure that our locals and our small businesses and our working class people invest. And this is a way we recognize that we can have investment. The co-op model is one man, one vote. So you literally protect these working class people from a hostile takeover, because we know, member for St. Michael West, there are some who may want to come to create a hostile takeover situation. But with a co-op, there's no hostile takeover. That is why the co-op model for the TAP program is an excellent model. And I've spoken to the member for St. Philip West for the co-op model for the cultural industry, for the promoters, for the singers who want to take their product abroad. I've spoken only yesterday for the co-op model for the used car dealers. And we have seen the Artisans and Contractors Association form a co-op, and they too are putting themselves in line for bidding for contracts in this country.